The morning sun barely touched the water when Margaret Thornwell's golf cart came humming down my dock like a wasp hunting prey. I heard it before I saw it, that electric whine cutting through the birdsong, followed by the click, click, click of her designer heels on weathered planks. I was securing my boat. My father's boat, actually. A 1987 Boston Whaler Outrage. 27 feet of memories held together by marine epoxy and love. The smell of salt water and diesel fuel mixed with morning dew. Sacred smells. Healing smells. She started shouting my name. Her voice could strip paint. She yelled, "Mr. Donovan!" But I didn't turn. Not yet. I finished tying the bowline, Dad's knot, the one he taught me when I was 8 years old. My hands knew the rope by muscle memory alone. She was closer now, telling me she was speaking to me. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and aggressive, like flowers screaming for attention. She said I had exactly 1 minute to acknowledge her official notice before she documented my non-compliance. That's when I turned. Margaret Thornwell stood 5 feet from me, her tablet thrust forward like a weapon. Behind her, 2 men in poorly fitting security uniforms flanked her golf cart. Their badges said, Lakeside HOA Security. The badges were crooked, cheap metal catching the light wrong. I called her ma'am. My voice still had that flat calm from 20 years of maritime law enforcement. I told her I was just securing my vessel. She spat the word vessel back at me like it tasted bad. She informed me my boat was in violation of some Lakeside Community Association code. That watercraft over 20 feet couldn't be docked without authorization. She gave me 72 hours to relocate it, or face daily fines of $500. She thrust the tablet closer. I could see the document. Official letterhead. Legal language. My address. A photograph of my boat taken from the water. Someone had kayaked out specifically to document my father's whaler. I told her this dock was on my property. She countered that the dock extends into community-managed waters. She said the lake was under HOA jurisdiction and suggested I should have read my covenants more carefully before purchasing here. Her smile was surgical, precise, designed to cut. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Soft, hesitant. It was my daughter Emma, standing in the screen door of our lake house, still in her pajamas. She just said, "Dad?" Margaret's eyes flicked to Emma, then back to me. She suggested I explain to my daughter the importance of following community rules. She said children learn from their parents' examples. The coldness in her voice, the calculation. She wanted Emma to hear this. Wanted my daughter to watch me get dressed down by someone with a clipboard and a golf cart. She gave me my 72 hours again, said the clock was ticking, and turned, her heels clicking a victory march back down my dock. Emma came down to the dock, barefoot, arms crossed. She asked me if they could actually do that. I put my arm around her shoulders and told her I'd look into it. But I was already looking into it. In my head, I was already 3 moves ahead. Because I'm not just a father trying to heal in peace. I'm not just a retired Coast Guard officer. I'm Jake Donovan, former Chief Warrant Officer, Coast Guard Investigative Service. And in the last 8 months of retirement, I'd done my homework. I owned this dock, and the 30 feet of waterway around it. But here's what Margaret Thornwell didn't know yet. I didn't just own my dock, I owned the entire lake. 347 acres of water, lake bed, and riparian rights. The HOA's community-managed waters? They managed nothing. They owned nothing. But I didn't tell Margaret that. Not yet. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is watching people who've gotten away with bullying for too long finally meet someone who knows exactly how to dismantle them. Piece by legal piece. Let me back up 6 months. Sarah died on a Tuesday. Pancreatic cancer. Emma stopped talking for 3 weeks afterward. The Coast Guard gave me compassionate leave. Then early retirement. So I did the only thing that made sense. I came home. To the lake. The dock became our therapy. Every morning Emma and I would sit on the dock while the water caught the sunrise. We didn't always talk, but we were together. I'd work on Dad's boat. Emma would hand me tools. Slowly, she started talking again. The boat became our project, our proof that broken things could be fixed. Then the letters started. The first one arrived on a Monday. Certified mail. A notice of violation from the Lakeside Community Association. It listed 3 violations: lawn height, my boat being visible, and dock repairs I'd performed without approval. Total fines, $850. I read it twice. Then I walked my property with a tape measure. My grass was shorter than they claimed. The boat was under a tarp. The dock repairs were a safety issue on my own property. I called the number on the letter. A woman named Brenda answered and told me all disputes had to be submitted in writing. When I tried to ask a question, she cut me off and hung up. I looked at the letter again. At the bottom, in small print, Compliance Director, Margaret Thornwell. I didn't submit a dispute form. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and started investigating. Lakeside Community Association was incorporated in 2019, just 6 years ago. Before that, it was a loose, voluntary association. Then Margaret Thornwell moved in. Within 8 months, she'd pushed through a mandatory HOA, hired her own management company, implemented a 400-page covenant document. Dues jumped from $200 a year to $3,000. The HOA website had public financials. I downloaded every report. The numbers didn't make sense. A huge reserve fund, but massive expenses, with no community amenities to show for it. I opened a spreadsheet, started tracking. Emma came into my office and asked what was wrong. I told her it was just paperwork. She wasn't fooled. She asked if it was about the letter. Then she told me that some of the kids at school had families who were really stressed about the HOA. That one family might have to sell their house. That a neighbor got fined for having non-conforming garden gnomes. Garden gnomes. She hesitated, then asked me the question that broke my heart. Are we going to be okay? I told her, always. I promised. After she left, I opened my laptop again. This time, I went deeper. I treated it like any Coast Guard investigation. Follow the money, find the pattern, document everything. Margaret Thornwell was running a systematic operation. I drove through the neighborhood, photographing every violation notice. 40% of homes were under citation. The violations were strategic, targeting young families, the elderly, and new residents. I pulled property records. 17 families had sold in 3 years. 13 of those sales were to a company called Lakeside Property Holdings, LLC. I ran the LLC. Officers, Margaret Thornwell and her husband, Derek. They weren't just finding people. They were buying their homes at distressed prices. On day 5, I met my neighbor, Walter Kemp. He was 78, a former federal prosecutor. He knew all about Margaret. He also knew that my family trust owned the subsurface and riparian rights to the entire lake. He asked me a simple question. Was I just trying to save my dock? Or was I interested in saving this whole community? I told him both. He smiled and said, "Good. Then let's get to work." Walter introduced me to others. Patricia Wong, a forensic accountant who found embezzlement indicators. David Reyes, a property attorney. Sarah Chen, an IT specialist with a server full of evidence. We started meeting weekly. The Lake Defense Committee. Patricia showed us the money trail. $860,000 was missing from the reserve fund, funneled to Margaret's own companies. David explained the foreclosure scheme, using fraudulent liens. Sarah played audio of Margaret calling homeowners undesirable elements. We had evidence, but we needed something undeniable. Walter looked at me and said, "Then we give her a target she can't resist." He meant me. The second notice arrived, this time about my boat. Margaret delivered it personally. I caught her trespassing on my dock on my security cameras. I sent the footage to David. He said it was beautiful, but not enough. We needed her to go bigger. She did. The fines started arriving daily. Then a lien. Then a foreclosure notice. Emma found it. She asked, her voice small and scared, if they were taking our house. I promised her they weren't. I told her sometimes bad people need to show everyone how bad they are before good people can stop them. She looked at me with her mother's eyes and said, "You're setting a trap." I told her I was documenting a crime. Margaret escalated. A demand for $13,000 in 48 hours. I didn't pay. I filed a formal complaint, asking for the legal basis for their jurisdiction over the lake. She cited a covenant section. I asked to see the original recorded documents proving it existed when I bought my home. She stopped responding. Walter got a call from the state attorney general's office. They had complaints but needed evidence of criminal activity, not just a civil dispute. Walter said we needed a felony. The next morning, the silence was shattered by the familiar, hated whine of the golf cart. But this time, it was followed by the heavy crunch of tires on gravel and the low rumble of a diesel engine. I looked out the window. Margaret Thornwell stood on my dock, a conductor of chaos, her tablet held aloft. With her were 4 men dressed in cheap dark blue tactical uniforms that screamed, "Mall Ninja," complete with bulky, empty utility belts and plastic badges that gleamed with a counterfeit sheen. Their movements were unnecessarily aggressive, all puffed-up chests and swagger. One of them, a hulking figure with a poorly trimmed goatee, was already at work. I saw the flash of steel in his hands, a pair of industrial bolt cutters. The sharp, metallic snap cut through the morning air as he severed my bowline. The rope, a thick, trusted braid of nylon, recoiled like a dying snake. My father's boat, the whaler, groaned as it shifted, its hull grinding against the dock's rubber bumper with a sound that made my teeth ache. They were cutting my boat loose. I didn't rush out. I watched from the window, my cameras recording everything. The men used bolt cutters on my lines. They weren't gentle. The hull of my father's boat scraped against the dock. Margaret stood back, filming it all on her tablet. They tied the whaler to their pontoon boat and started towing it away. That's when I walked outside. Barefoot, coffee in hand. I said good morning to Margaret. She turned with that surgical smile and told me the HOA was enforcing compliance, that my vessel was being relocated pending payment. I asked her calmly, under what authority? She said, covenant authority. I asked to see the officers' credentials, their names, badge numbers, and legal authority to seize property. One of the men stepped forward, trying to be intimidating, saying they were authorized by the HOA. I told him that wasn't a law enforcement agency. I asked if he had a peace officer certification, a state license. His hand moved to his belt, to something that looked like a gun. I kept my voice level. I told him, please don't reach for your weapon, that I wasn't resisting, just asking a legal question. Margaret stepped between us, saying I was interfering with official HOA business and could be cited for obstruction. I told her I'd called the sheriff to report a felony theft in progress, a vessel valued at $40,000. I mentioned that impersonating law enforcement was also a felony. I told her I'd been documenting her operation for 7 weeks. The fake violations, the embezzlement, the foreclosure scheme. I said, I'm Jake Donovan, Chief Warrant Officer, retired, Coast Guard Investigative Service. You picked the wrong boat. Then came the sound of vehicles. Multiple vehicles, sheriff's cruisers, state police, an FBI sedan. They'd been staging at Walter's house, waiting for my signal. Sheriff Morrison approached. He knew me from my old job. He asked if these were the men. I confirmed they were. Margaret tried to claim it was a civil matter. Morrison corrected her. Felony theft is not a civil matter. Neither is impersonating law enforcement. He confronted the fake officers, who had no real credentials. The FBI agent, Special Agent Hayes, approached. She informed Margaret they had executed search warrants and were freezing all of her company accounts. Margaret's legs buckled. She sputtered that this was harassment. Then my neighbors emerged. Patricia Wong presented her report on the embezzlement. Walter Kemp delivered his legal brief documenting RICO violations. David Reyes announced the civil suits. Sarah Chen presented her digital archives, including audio of Margaret's undesirable elements comment. Margaret looked at the circle of people she'd dismissed and asked if we'd coordinated this. I told her, "Actually, you coordinated this. We just documented it." The click of the handcuffs, a precise, cold, and final snick of stainless steel, was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in months. It was the sound of a lock turning on her reign of terror. Margaret's surgically maintained composure shattered completely. Her shoulders slumped, her head bowed, and the perfectly applied makeup on her face now seemed like a grotesque mask over a crumbling facade. As Sheriff Morrison firmly took her by the arm and began walking her to his cruiser, a low murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. It started with a single, hesitant clap from old Mr. Gable's porch, then another from the Chen family's driveway, and then, as if a dam had burst, the whole shoreline erupted in a thunderous, cathartic wave of applause and cheers. It wasn't just noise, it was a collective exhale, a roar of liberation that had been pent up for years. People were hugging, crying, and pumping their fists in the air, their faces alight with a long-lost sense of relief and victory. The screen door creaked softly behind me. Emma came out, her steps tentative at first, then quickening as she crossed the porch and came to my side. Her hand slipped into mine, her grip surprisingly strong, her fingers cold from nerves but holding on tight. She didn't take her eyes off the spectacle of Margaret Thornwell being guided into the back of the sheriff's cruiser. The raucous applause from the shoreline seemed to wash over her. In a voice barely above a whisper, thick with a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope, she asked, "Did we just win?" I looked down at her, at the reflection of the flashing police lights in her wide brown eyes, the same eyes that had held so much sorrow for so long, now finally alight with something else. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "We did, sweetheart," I said, my own voice rough with a surge of emotion. "We really did." She leaned her head against my arm, the tension finally draining from her small frame. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at me. I lifted my gaze from her and found Walter standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his corduroy jacket, a look of profound, quiet satisfaction on his weathered face. He met my eyes, and his smile was not one of triumph, but of renewal. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Now?" he said, his voice calm and steady, cutting clearly through the fading cheers. "Now we rebuild. The right way. The trial took 11 months. Margaret Thornwell got 12 years in federal prison. The real satisfaction was what happened after. The FBI found all the embezzled money. Every family that had been fined received full restitution, with interest. Our case sparked a statewide investigation into HOA fraud. New laws were passed. We dissolved the old HOA and formed a new, voluntary, Reasonable Property Owners Association. Walter became president. My part was done. Months later, Emma and I took the whaler out on the lake. Our lake. She asked me why I didn't just tell Margaret from the start that I owned the lake. I told her it wasn't about ownership. It was about power. Margaret needed a target she thought she could beat. I let her show everyone what she was. Emma looked at the water and said, "Mom would have liked this." I asked if she meant the investigation. She said, "The fact that you protected people, that you didn't just protect us." She was right. Today, the lake is quiet again. The good kind of quiet. Emma's 17 now. She wants to study environmental law to protect places like this. A new family moved in recently. They'd heard about the HOA and asked if it was safe now. I told them the whole story. As they left, the wife thanked me for fighting. I told her, "Thank you for moving here. Communities are made by people who care enough to stay." The lesson is this. Margaret thought she could weaponize rules to control people. She forgot that communities are built on something stronger. People who've had enough. People who know their rights. People who will stand up for their neighbors. She forgot that sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate is exactly the wrong person to mess with. The lake is still mine. The dock is still mine. But the real ownership? That's shared. With every family that stood up. That's the kind of ownership Margaret never understood. And that's why she lost. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? A power-hungry board member? A neighbor who weaponized petty rules? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're currently fighting an HOA battle, document everything. Know your rights. Find your Walter, your Patricia, your David. You're not alone.